Okay. Assalamu alaikum, shalom aleichem, peace be upon you. Today, we're going to have a very special session. The Middle East is known as the cradle of a lot of the major religions that have spread throughout the world. And they have a lot of effect on the human psyche, culture, and also on the environment. In today's session, we're going to explore the combined role of religion, desert ecology, and cultural narrative in promoting environmental diplomacy in order to tackle the global environmental crisis. It is my honor today to welcome three very special guests, and I would love to introduce them today. First, I will start with Rabbi Michael. Rabbi Michael Cohen has been involved with the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies since its door opened in 1996, teaching courses to the Bible and the environment. He divided his time between Vermont and Kibbutz Keturah, Israel. He always works for the Friends of the Arava Institute and is a visiting faculty member at Bennington Center for Advancement of Public Action, teaching classes on conflict resolution, as well as different aspects of biblical studies. He has written extensively about the environment and the Middle East peace process in North America and Middle Eastern publication, and is the author of Einstein's Rabbi, A Tale of Science and the Soul. Einstein's Rabbi, A Tale of Science and the Soul. I would love also to add, as an alumni of the Institute, Rabbi Michael also could be, if you're a student at the Institute, your guardian angel. Every time you have a question, you need some advice, just write to Rabbi Michael and he will give you his best advice and make his best to try to answer your questions and help you. Our second distinguished guest is Sarah. Sarah Perle Benazera. Sarah is a humanist, peace activist, storyteller, and educator. With years of hands-on experience in international and intercultural dialogue, working at the people-to-people level for a better Middle East. After studying at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies and meeting for the first time Jordanians and Palestinians, Sarah decided that cross-cultural dialogue and peace building were her callings. She worked as a project manager and blog editor at Yalla Young Leaders for 5 years, developing and running a citizen journalism program. She has been involving in multiple, I'm sorry, I have a problem with my screen, I apologize. Developing and running a citizen journalism program. She has been involved in multiple peace and cooperation projects, organizing conferences, participating in panels and programs about peace education and cooperation, and working and volunteering with Kids for Peace Jerusalem. Sarah works with numerous peace organizations, including the Arava Institute, where she co-facilitates dialogue sessions, and with Jerusalem Peace Builders, where she crafts and leads programs for Israeli and Palestinian teams. She studied environmental studies and cross-border cooperation at Sde Boker and the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, as well political philosophy at the Université Panthéon-Sorbonne in Paris. Welcome, Sarah. Our third distinguished guest is Jessica Yasmin-Barhum, BA Ons Dep LA. Jessica is a British-Swiss Muslim revert, married to Musa in his village of Ain Rafa since 2004. Where they live with their 4 children. She gained her Israeli citizenship in 2019, trained as a landscape architect, and at Leeds Metropolitan University, Jessica came to Jerusalem for the first time in 1999-2000 on a scholarship program at the Jerusalem Botanical Gardens. Upon completing her degree in 2001, embarking on her career, she reverted to the religion of Islam in 2003. Since living in Israel, Jessica has volunteered and worked with many environmental planning organizations, including a wide variety of community-based projects, some more successful than others, in tackling the pressing issues of the state of the environment at the hand of man. Sorry, again, I have issue with my screen. I apologize. Her projects include community consultation process in planning of Isawiye in East Jerusalem with BIMCOM, Planners for Planning Rights, mapping possible sites for Jewish Arab community gardens in East Jerusalem with SPNI, Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel, environmental education project in schools in East Jerusalem with the National Parks Agency and the Jerusalem Botanical Gardens, with specific focus on cultural narrative and indigenous medicinal plants, presenting as a panelist at conferences organized by the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, giving Islamic perspective on man's relationship with the environment, and proposing the advance of renewable energy with reference to Islamic texts. Since 2011, she is also involved in the development of plan for Ain Rafa after having experienced her own house being demolished in 2007, attempting to ensure real community consultation by the planning system in the development of the unique indigenous rural community she lives in. Living here as a non-Arab Muslim has given Jessica a unique and personal perspective on life in Israel, with regular access to family and friends in the West Bank. She is fluent in the colloquial Arabic and Hebrew, as well as German, French, and Swiss German. Since 2006, the family home has become an open house for visitors from all over the world who would like to deeper insights into Arab-Israeli life. Their family-run business, Living in the Levant, offers visitors meeting at the local mosque to learn about Islam, guides tour of the village of Ain Rafa, presentations, discussion of life in Israel, Palestine, and home hospitality, treating visitors to the delights of Palestinians' kitchen. I would like to invite to welcome Lori. Dear Lori is a pillar of this whole seminar series, and also she worked very hard in planning this session. And we would like also to wish her a big Mazal Tov and Mabruk. She became Bobby, Safta, Set, grandma. So she apologized for not taking parts in today's session, but you're gonna find her DNA in every part of that session. So Mabruk, Lori, and Mazal Tov to Ruben, all the health and happiness and all the good things. May he grow and make your life happier by the day. I would love to mention the fact that we are aware that the Middle East is very rich and very diverse with faith and religious sects that make its rich mosaics. We apologize in advance. Because of time constraints and also limitation of logistics, we could only today offer some three perspectives on the interfaith environmental dialogue. But having said so, we know that many of you may also have background and different perspective about religion and environmentalism. So we would like to ask you to take an active part in the discussion and in the Q&A session to give us an insightful perspective that we may have missed. We also want to reflect a little bit about the current situation that's happening right now in Jerusalem. And I would love to say that is why this session today is very important, because in a sense, it's interfaith dialogue which connect the human with the environment. And despite the very difficult political situation, we are building true bridges of peace by having this session today, especially in this very, very unfortunately sad and tense and political situation. So having said that, without further overdue, I would love to welcome our guests. And Rabbi Michael, please go ahead. I would like to ask everybody to have a leap of faith in this session. Enjoy that session, and may God bless all of you. Bye-bye.
Farid, thank you for your all too kind words and for helping to organize this, as also to Lori and Franny and Rebecca who helped put this together. So as the first batter here, if you will, my goal is to create the ideal, and then as we go on through our discussion, it's are we able to walk the talk of the ideal? So that's kind of what the piece that I'm going to be presenting here. And for that, I want to go to yesterday's Torah portion with that very famous line, "V'yachavta l'recha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule, if you will. and that we understand neighbor as someone who we feel a responsibility towards. And the intensity of that responsibility is greatest with those most adjacent in the concentric circles of our lives. This past year of COVID has made us aware that those circles further from us are closer than we think, making even more true the words of Rabbi Yochanan Prince: neighbor is not a geographic term, it is a moral concept. In that spirit, the conflict resolution theorist and activist Liz Bolding talks about building a global civic community. As our climate unravels, it may be time to expand those concentric circles outside of an anthropocentric to a biocentric orientation. Scores of teachings within Judaism can maximize our understanding of our relationship to this world. God calls the totality of creation in Genesis, the sentient and the insentient, very good. Related this upcoming year, we have the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year, which both people and land both need rest. As we rise and face the realities of pandemics, climate change, and other challenges, we should understand our neighbor as Kol Ha'olam Kulo, the whole entire world. Holiness is the ability to see at the core of us, the environment, and all of creation, is that we are all tethered together. We are made of the same stuff, literally and figuratively. And with that comes responsibility that transcends ideas, personal, national, species, etc. It's why at the Arava Institute, we say nature knows no borders. The philosopher Levinas talks about the moral exodus we need to take out of ourselves. We need to step out of how we see things, how we categorize things, how we label things. In that spirit, in his incredible, incredible piece on saving the environment, Pope Francis I, the Laudato Si that he wrote, he writes the following: purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. Like we think of purchasing as economics, he's saying no, there's also morality involved there. And actually he's quoting his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI in this, but in much of this incredible paper about the environment of Pope Francis I, a lot of it is a critique of the economic system of the world and the interconnectality of all of that. As I said earlier, within Judaism, we find so many messages that ask us to step outside of the usual boundaries of understanding what is what. As I said earlier, this biocentric orientation is so clear there. Again, talking about everything is very good. The Hebrew word toldot means generations, and usually we apply it to people, ve'ela toldot Yitzhak, and these are the generations of Isaac. What's fascinating is the first time it appears, the word toldot, generations, is about the heaven and the earth in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. That is the exact same word that we use to tell our human story is used to tell the story of the universe and all of creation. Just like all of creation is told, the totality of it is very, very good. Within that biocentric orientation is the diversity of everything. And what's fascinating is when we look at the beginning of Genesis, we are reminded over and over and over again of the importance of diversity. Of course, we have the first week of creation when everything is called very good. We then move to the Noah story where Noah is told to bring all the different species of animals, so the diversity of animal life will continue after the flood. At the end of the Noah story, there's a rainbow put in the sky, a reminder to God never to destroy the world again by a flood. But a rainbow is that amazing symbol of diversity. A single ray of sunlight hits water, the source of life, and is refracted into a diversity of colors. And then finally, a few verses later, we have the story of Babel, where we get the Babel of languages, which is usually read as a punishment, all these diverse languages. Yeshaya Leibowitz, the great philosopher of the last century, and his sister, the great Torah commentator, Nechama Leibowitz, he talks about as he read this, he escaped Poland, he and his sister escaped Poland and knew what fascism was. And he looks at a society where everyone is told to speak one language and do one thing. He said, that's a fascist society. He says, Babel was a description of fascism. The antithesis of fascism, which wants to get rid of diversity, is to create diversity. So at the end of the story, when we have these diverse languages, it's not a punishment. It's actually a corrective back. And if you look at what I call the throwaway verses in the Torah that no one pays attention to, but between the story of Noah and Babel, we learn that the children of Noah spread around the world with their own different languages. That diversity is how things were supposed to be. So at the end of the Babel story, it's not a punishment, it's a corrective back to how things are supposed to be. So not once, twice, three, but 4 times at the very beginning of Genesis, we are told the power, the importance of diversity. In Genesis, twice in Noah, and in the story of Babel. Diversity is the basis of everything. If you have a stock portfolio, you should have diverse stocks. Our parents always tell us need a diverse types of food on our plate. Everything to make a healthy life is about diversity. We want diverse religions. We want diverse cultures. The healthiest parts of the universe or of our world are the coral reefs and the rainforests because they're the most diverse. Diversity is the key to everything. And our challenge as the species that we are is not to get rid of our diversity, but not allow those diversities to create walls. They should rather be bridges and doors to curiosity of how others think and how others walk in this world. That is our great challenge that the traditions give us. And in all the monotheistic religions that all say that we go and are created from one source, it puts us in that sense of relationship to each other and the world that we live in. Our challenge is, and this is what we'll do the rest of this time here, is are we able to live up to that challenge and that fundamental lesson of the religions, that we come from one source, we are interconnected, and have a responsibility both to human life and the other life that we see in this world.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Michael. I'm going to bring it over to Sarah next, since we're having some technical difficulties with Jessica Yasmin, but she should be on soon.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us. My name is Sarah Perle Benazera, and I'm a storyteller. And the truth is, it's a nice way to say that I'm story obsessed. And I think that by listening to Rabbi Michael, you just understood why he's such a popular lecturer when it comes to the kibbutz. When I was a student many moons ago, I didn't take his class, but after a few weeks, it was very clear that I made a big mistake. So I made sure to join all the other things he was organizing on the side of the classes to make sure that I could be there and listen to his stories, because he's a wonderful storyteller. So I will tell you a little bit about stories and how in our context, which is Israel-Palestine, but also talking about the environment, how in this very specific context, how stories are important and how they create narratives that have so much meaning and that can be used in so many different ways. So when you think about Israel-Palestine, just listening to me, you say, okay, so are you pro-Israel or are you pro-Palestine? Usually that's a question that comes very often if you travel the world and you say that you're from here, that you've been here, as if we really had to choose, as if the interconnection that Rabbi Michael just talked about was erased. There was this dichotomy. You need to choose. You need to choose your side, and you need to choose your narrative. And attached to this narrative, there's a truth. Only one truth that separates you from the other side. This is the context we live in. Especially when you are going through conflict, this dichotomy becomes stronger and stronger because you need to belong to one side. And I'm sure that everyone who's here sitting in the US can relate. Only two sides. You need to choose which one you belong to. When the truth is that there are so many more colors, there are so many different sides, there are so many different stories. What about Jews from Yemeni descent? What about Jews from Ethiopia or Ethiopian descent? What about Russian citizens of Israel? Some of them would describe themselves as Jews, others won't. What about Bedouins? What about Armenian, who, yes, belong to Christianity within the Holy Land, but have their very own story and have their very own community and their culture within Israel, Palestine? What about Bedouins and Bedouins from the Negev and Bedouins from the north, from the Galil? What about Palestinians who are also coming from Syria or who are coming from Jordan or who come from Gaza or the West Bank? They will have different stories too. But especially because we live in a conflict, because we need those very clear boundaries and limits between us to make it simpler, we pretend that there are only two stories, only two narratives. And in this conflict and competition of stories and narratives in Israel-Palestine, nature plays a crucial role, because the camp, the side that will claim in the best way, the most powerful way, its truer, stronger, more legitimate connection to the land, to the nature, will get the upper hand. They have more the right to be here because they are connected to the land, because they belong to the land and the land belongs to them. So from the very beginning of our conflict, nature has been part of our narratives. The environment has been part of both narratives. And for me as a Jew, I grew up listening to the stories of the land of milk and honey. I also grew up listening to the stories of the kibbutz movement that was so strong about its connection to agriculture. Agriculture is a huge part of the Israeli identity, because again, it's this connection to the land, to the soil. If you can bloom the desert, that didn't really mean that the desert belongs to us. And when I was in my 20s, I realized that I was missing an entire other connection. That was also the truth of the land where I felt at home, which was the narratives of the Palestinians and their connection to the land, and how it was so visceral that the land, the environment, nature, it was part of the Palestinian identity in a way I could never imagine. Because the land for Palestinian is about your pride, your identity, your family, your heritage. The land, the specific location and connection, not this romantic ideology about the land that I could have heard in the Zionist narrative, but this very visceral, very practical, pragmatic connection to where you're from, to where you grow your food, to where you build your house. And that story about nature, that connection with the environment and with the land, is something that defines the Palestinian people, but that to me was out of sight. And it took me years of working with Palestinians to only start to scratch the surface of this connection. And I could never say that I entirely understand it today. I can only respect it and still learn and ask from my Palestinian friends to tell me more and be quiet and respect that connection. The only thing that right now, and for many years, the narrative and story that had the upper hand was the Jewish one. And so our connection to the land was the legitimate one, because it's the loudest. But we need to make room for all the different stories, all the different connections. And going back to that interconnection that Rabbi Michael spoke about, because this is the essence of this land. It's a mosaic. This is what Farid said at the very beginning, and it's so true. We have so many stories, and erasing them into two sides will never give us any solution. And that's why I'm fascinated about stories. And that's why I will never stop discovering new stories in this place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulties with Jessica Yasmin-Barhum joining us. So we apologize for this technical glitch, but I think we could also continue with the discussion until Jessica Jasmine could join us, and we'll give her the time and the spotlight to share with us her lecture also. So Francis, would you like to take the Q&A? It's now the Q&A, or like the panel?
Yes, there haven't been many questions that have come into the chat, but if people have any preliminary questions they'd like to pose to either Sarah and or Rabbi Michael, please send them right now. I have one question from Rashid. It says a question for Rabbi Michael. Diversity is key to everything, an open-ended slogan. Do you think a Jewish state copes with diversity in its wide meaning? And I guess you could take that to mean diversity in the sense of the Jewish and Arab populations, or different levels of religiosity amongst populations in Israel, or just being a different state in the Middle East where it does provide a sense of diversity.
Great question, thank you. I would say, I'm going to go to Israel in a second. I would say walking the talk of really embracing what diversity means and to live a diverse life is a challenge for all of humanity. I would argue that Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Gandhi were able to embrace that, where they even understood those that they were in conflict with. They had that connection, that underlying connection to that humanity that I talked about earlier. Very few people reach the level of the three of them, and that's part of our challenge as humans to get better at that. When it comes to Israel, has a lot more walking to get there, as many countries do. And in terms of Israel specific, you can talk about within Israeli, let's talk about within the Israeli Jewish population to start with. There was a split, as we know, between religious and non-religious in terms of how the country was set up. There's clearly within Israel, there is a split between Jewish and Arab, separate school systems. And so we find a lot of diversity not leading to curiosity of, oh, how do you do that? But to divisions. One of the reasons why I think that the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies is so successful is because it happens to be located on Kibbutz Keturah. And just as background, Kibbutz Keturah was founded in 1973. Oh, how we name things, right? The Yom Kippur War. It's also known as the War of Ramadan. It's also known as the October War or the 73 War. And each of those titles brings its own vista to the exact same event. After that event, Kibbutz Keturah was founded a month later through an American Zionist youth movement called Young Judea. It's the youth movement of the Hadassah Hospital in the United States. And they brought with them, I would argue, the best of American Zionism. It was Zionism infused with the notion of democratic principles and pluralism and diversity. And so in Kibbutz Keturah, you have intentionally both religious and non-religious Jews living together. You then bring in the Arava Institute, where this diverse student body of Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Moroccans, Americans, and others, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, atheists, etc., who are coming into a community that understands the value and the challenges. I'm not saying it's always easy to live in that diverse world, but the success of the Institute, I would argue, because it's on a community within Israel that does understand that value. And so I would argue that Israel has a lot of walking to do to get closer to this. I'll close with this observation about the Talmud. And the Talmud, which is the great rabbinic discussions of the Torah and Jewish law, rabbis who disagreed with each other were paired together. That is, someone you disagreed with was not the enemy to be crushed. They were there to prove maybe you're wrong, maybe they're wrong, maybe you're both right, and you need to combine what you think are two separate ways. Maybe you learn to just fine-tune your argument, but we've got to get past this notion of people and ideas that we disagree with are the enemy to be destroyed. We need to be curious to understand how other people think. And that's our challenge, both in Israel and around the world.
Great, thank you. Another question. What are the commonalities and differences on how Judaism, Christianity, Islam see the protection of land, earth, and water? Well, maybe we should wait until Jessica Yasmin comes in to answer that. But okay, here's a question just for Sarah. In your work, how do you create spaces that are safe for people to share those stories with you? Depending on where she is, I imagine that tensions in the room with others might make it harder for stories to come out in a productive way. How do you manage this?
Thank you for the very straightforward question. I'm going to try to keep it short, because basically you asked me, what is your job and how do you do it? So I will use a quote from James Baldwin, which to me is such a source of wisdom and knowledge, still so incredibly relevant, sadly, all around the world. And when he says, sorry, I'm just going to put the words back in the right order. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can change unless it's faced. And that's how I use storytelling. We will not go anywhere unless we address the many elephants in the room. And for many years, there was a tradition of just putting Israelis and Palestinians in a room and talk about culture and talk about the things we could have in common and the food. But that will not help us. We need to go deeper. We need to really share everyone's stories. And to me, storytelling is a safe act. It doesn't mean it's not challenging. It doesn't mean it is not awkward sometimes or terrifying even. But it is about creating empathy. It's about putting yourself not as a representative and an ambassador of your entire people, which make discussion impossible, but as this one person with emotions. Because the one thing that storytelling does is that it brings up the emotion that we do have in common for sure. If it's talking about fear, hope, love, laughter, if it's about loss, I will understand you, even if I come from the opposite narrative, because those emotions, they're human emotions and I can connect. And I will see you, as the human being in front of me with a story I can relate to. And through storytelling, and it requires time, of course, especially when you're talking about Israelis and Palestinians, but it removes the competition, because our conflict has been mostly about competition. Who was here first? Which side are you for? Who is the most legitimate? Who was the truer, more beautiful connection to the land? But storytelling erases a competition because it shows diversity, it shows layers, it shows complexity, and it makes room for emotion. And sharing those emotions can lead to co-activism. So we can change the things that are unbearable. So we can acknowledge the injustices without losing a feeling of loyalty to our side. So we can denounce the cruelty of the situation without losing any piece of our identity. Because when I do some storytelling and I go into my personal story, and I'm an Algerian Jew who was born in France, my story doesn't appear in any national narrative. But when I do a storytelling workshop, suddenly there is room for my story. And when there is room for my story, then the price of my Judaism or my Judaity cannot be my humanity. So there is room for my legitimacy here on this land and my story with this land, but it's not taking away the root of the native story, the native presence, the native legitimacy and fight, which is a Palestinian fight. So storytelling is about layers, emotions, humanity, and in my case and in our context, co-activism. I hope I answered your question.
It's great, thank you. Maybe we'll go back to that original question I started reading, and Fareed, maybe you can chime in on the Islam portion of it. Here's the question. What are the commonalities and differences of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and other religions present in the Middle East, or anywhere for that matter? See the protection of land, earth, and water. What does each religion say about this? So we have two of many religions present on right now, so.
I would love to say I'm not a Muslim scholar. Like, Islam is very rich in materials about environmentalism, about our relationship with Earth, like God's relationship, which is bestowed on us as humans, how we should like tell the Earth. So I just would love to give a small introduction. And again, it's from my perspective as environmental teacher. I'm trying to fill a little bit here for Yasmin, but I would love to share my screen just to give you like a preliminary introduction into Islam and environmentalism. So I will share my screen. So we usually, just a sec, please. It's usually we do this lecture, we're trying to encourage imams at mosques to try to address the issue of environmentalism at the Friday sermon. I just want to say to all non-Muslims, in Islam, Friday is the sacred day, and you have Friday's prayer. There they have khutbat al-Jum'ah, Friday's like sermon, where the imam, like the sheikh of the mosque, will address the pressing issues of the day-to-day that his community are facing. And we're trying, me as a teacher also, my fellows, trying to introduce and encourage imams to step into the world of environmentalism with their community. So I just will give a very brief introduction. In Islam, there are two sacred sources. The first one is the Quran, the words of God. They are the ayat, the verses, and those are like sacred. And the second source is the hadith, is the sacred words of the Prophet Muhammad. And like, first of all, when I start this activity, I usually ask people like which hadith are like the verses that they usually found very deep and meaningful. And they will be surprised to see that a lot of the hadith and the verses are actually very environmental in their nature. So one of like the hadith you could say, which says, "Kulu waتصدقوا وَإِلْبَسُوا فِي غَيْرِ إِسْرَافٍ وَلَا مُخَيِّلَةٍ," where the prophets ask the people, eat and pledge money and give money to the people and wear, but please don't waste, like without overstretching. Try to be modest. We see a lot of verses that relate to the issue of waste. Waste in Islam is very, let's say, bad habit. It's looked upon as not ethical and also against the rules of Islam. So if we continue to the second slide, we could see some of the verses which relate to environmentalism. So this verse, I found it very meaningful, where Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, God says, وإذا قال ربك للملائكة إني جاعل في الأرض خليفة قال وتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء ونحن نسبح بحمدك ونقدس لك قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. صدق الله العظيم. Again, I'm not a Muslim scholar, but I like this verse a lot. It's from the Surah Al-Baqarah, because the angels asked God, how could you like make humans your Khalifa? Your Khalifa are like your, let's say, the people who are gonna inherit earth from you. Those people who are gonna ruin it, gonna make bloodsheds, and we are the angels that who we praise your name. And God says, I trust my people, and I'm beknown to things that you don't know. And for me, this is very emotional that God's trust in every one of us is Khalifa on this planet. Is like I should take the responsibility to be like to live up to the expectation of the Islamic religion. So you could see also a lot of
Assalamu
the
alaikum.
alaikum assalam. So I think Jessica,
Yes,
first of all, صيام مقبول وإفطارا شهيا. I'm sorry, I tried to fill a little bit, but I'm gonna move and give the spotlights to you. So welcome, and
that's
I
good.
hope that, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. I'm actually I just was listening to what you were saying, and I've also picked the same area. Hang on, let me just get myself organized. Can someone just fill me in on where we are in the meeting, as it were? How long
So
ago
yeah,
you started?
Jessica, we were Jasmine, we were giving an introductory for each participant, and you were supposed to go first, but because of the technical difficulties, we gave the green light for Rabbi Michael and Sarah Benazera. So you are more than welcome to share your introduction, and then we're gonna have the panel discussion and the Q&A session, and also listening to our community if they have a different and enriching perspective about religions and environment. So that's where we are right now.
Okay. Okay. So it's my turn now. Okay. So with regards to the question or the statement of exploring the role of religion, desert ecology, and cultural narrative in promoting environmental diplomacy, the way I've tackled it is also, I've come at it from a few different angles. If we start with the angle of religion, so obviously I'm also looking at it from the Islamic perspective, and I see a crossover both between obviously the religion and the environment and culture and religion. So I've kind of drawn, as it were, three circles that interact with each other. And the challenge that I see that we have is to find the intricate balance between each of the three in order to be able to move forward in tackling the global crisis. So from the point of religion, I mean, I didn't hear exactly what you said, Farid, but I exactly came in on the quote that you were saying in Surah Al-Baqarah, where after the creation of Adam, the angel's response to God's creation is that why would you place someone like this on the earth who will create mischief and bloodshed while we, the angels, praise you and glorify you and, in other words, are perfect beings? And in the answer of God replying, surely I know what you do not know, this is where I think we start to find some of the clues and some of the hope to start to tackle the crisis that we're coming closer and closer towards in today's world. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Yes, sorry. I'm on a phone, so I don't.
Yeah, we hear
I feel like
you
I'm a bit on my
perfectly.
own.
We hear you fine.
Okay. So, living in Israel, I'm both a Muslim. I reverted to Islam back in 2003. I'm living in a minority community as a woman in a Jewish majority country. And I'm working within the environmental sector in practical projects, a lot of them in the area of East Jerusalem. And the overlap of both religion, environment, and culture are things that I come across in everyday life a lot. So the way that I started to look at it was the point of Islam is that it's a certain way of life. The fact that the creation is around us, points to the fact that God exists for a Muslim. So proof of God's existence is the creation itself. And the human being is an intricate part of that creation. We're not separated from the rest of creation, but we are created with privileges over and above the rest of the world. So as Farid was explaining, the human is the last entity that God creates as his best effort, as it were, and then that he puts God to place his deputy or agent or viceroy on the earth. So the earth is for our service, as it were. When it comes to environment, the fact that you, or the seminar specifically talks about desert ecology, also for me was quite an inspiration from the point of view of, I studied a little bit about desert ecology, especially when I first came to the country, because it's so different from, what we know in Northern Europe. And I think there are certain principles of desert ecology in particular that we can take both to be inspiration, but also to be kind of threats that we need to be wary of. So on the level of desert ecology, the fragility of this kind of ecology, because of the extreme temperatures, the extreme environment that it is, the cycle of life and death, where there's a very clear difference between when there is any small droplets of water and how that life springs into being, compared to, the dormant stage or the dead stage of a plant when there's no access to water whatsoever. Adaptation. So there are many amazing adaptations, particularly within the plant world and in the animal world, of living in such an extreme environment, and this idea of the will to survive. So I think there are some principles of, in particular, desert ecology, but I think from the environment, if we look at the environment in general, that we can start to look at an intricacy and a balance that we need to really respect in order to be able to understand where we fit into the picture. So if I combine that idea of being a Muslim, so being an intricate part of the creation and really given the privilege of all of the rest of creation by God, and then look at the creation that he's created and the intricacies and the very fine balance that he has set everything towards, that should really inspire me to understand more and also believe, have faith in what I read in my religion and the way that I live my life. So that's how I see those two things crossing over. And I describe it as a kind of evidence of our role as human beings in the environment, and also evidence of our effect on the environment. Then the other part of the title we were talking about is so religion, desert ecology, and cultural narrative. Cultural narrative also crosses over with religion and the environment. My personal experience of moving here, like I said, being a Muslim revert, living in a minority community, also as a woman in this community, I see a lot of overlaps between the indigenous culture that I've been lucky enough to fall into and live with people who have been here for several hundred years, and out of the Palestinian communities that are in this part of the world, I live in a rural community, so they're known as the Falahim, the peasant community, and there is a very, very strong culture and narrative relating to the land itself and the intricate relationship between the Palestinian people and the land, living off the land. So if we look at folklore, songs, dances, cross-stitch, there is evidence of an agricultural background and a interdependence on the land going back centuries, and it's still very much there today. That then ties in with the religion of Islam from the point of view that the majority, I'm not saying everybody, but the majority of the indigenous Arabs in this part of the world are Muslim. And the religion itself makes many cross references to the environment and our ability to use what God has provided for us to, better our lives and to live, etc. So we still have the remnants of that very strongly in the community where I live, because it's still within living memory, just about, that people had to go to the spring to collect water, that they were grinding flour with their own hands. So that I think is quite unique compared to where I come from in Northern Europe, where we're already centuries after that, where we weren't having to grow our own food in order to survive. Am I doing okay for time? Is someone keeping time? So for me, the crossover between religion and culture is very much comes to fruition within the Palestinian indigenous culture that I'm lucky to be part of. And here we start to look also at the human influence on the environment. So in environmental projects that I've been taking part in since I've been living here, and also that I've read about in other parts of the Middle East, there is a quite clever idea that you, in order to raise awareness and also trying to think of the word in English, how would you say that? Like to care for what's going on, to have reason to care for what's going on, we need to speak to people in a cultural language that they would understand, that rouses within them, maybe also passion for the environment, but maybe also their concerns for the environment. And this is something that I've been working with, particularly with some of the green institutions in Israel, who are always coming to projects from a very Jewish narrative, to do with the Jewish connection to the environment. There's then a challenge to translate that into the language of the local people, and how to instigate projects to better the environment and to promote sustainability, etc., etc. The crossover then between culture and environment. So I've talked about the crossover between religion and environment, the crossover between religion and culture. Now I'm going to talk about the crossover between the culture and the environment. Is where for me, how I've described it is where balance comes into play. So what that could be translated into is sustainability. Sustainability is about balancing our resources so that they will not be used up and people can continue to benefit from the creation that God has given us into the future. Another is a balance of the impact of the human on ecology or the local environment. And I mentioned before the fragility of the desert environment. We have something maybe not quite as fragile in the area that I live in, which is the Judean Hills, but we have in the Judean Hills, we have actually a unique relationship of human presence in the land for thousands of years, which actually nature has almost become dependent on as well. So a perfect example of that is terracing hillsides. So the impact of man in balance with nature can benefit nature as well. And then finally, what I wanted to also bring to the table, as it were, was the balance of legitimacy. Now, when I say legitimacy, is the legitimacy of different people's relationship to the land. And this is something that I've just touched on before, but I think is key to understanding on a national level or on a local level within Israel-Palestine to start to tackle the environmental issues, is that we have to be able to develop a cultural language to talk to people about the environment and to get policy about the environment that relates to specific problems of specific groups. And at the moment, my personal experience of living in Israel, I live in 1948 Israel, I don't live in the territories, but even within Israel, forwarding that cultural narrative of the Palestinian tie to the land and how that can be an addition to the existing narrative of the Jewish tie to the land and actually be beneficial to all, is incredibly challenging because of the politics here and because of the lack of really environmental policy and diplomacy. That is what we're looking for.
Great, thank you.
That's kind of where I've got to.
Yeah, thank you. That was really wonderful to listen to. And even though you don't have video, I think it's really great that you were able to get on. So now,
yes,
I guess
me too.
I think now we'll move on to a conversation between our speakers today, between Jessica, Yasmin, Sarah, and Rabbi Michael. How do you want to do this? Do you want me to open it up with a question, or do you have questions for each other, or how do you want to start this part?
Unfortunately, I didn't hear what Michael said, so.
I also would be curious if anybody had in the audience, if they have more questions.
Yeah.
I would love to hear them directly, or if they want to type them in the chat, if they don't want to speak up.
Yeah, I guess this question could be a good one to start with. It's about more specifically the Arava Institute, but I think we can scale it up to be a conversation about the intercultural diversity and nature of environmental narratives in the Middle East today. So this is from Hannah. Sarah mentions that the Jewish religion is the loudest in Israel. How does the Arava Institute acknowledge this and make space for other voices? As an agnostic Jordanian, I'm curious whether the Arava Institute has a certain religion it subscribes to. But I think that question is perhaps is like a signifier of a larger conversation that's going on in the Middle East right now as it pertains to conversations about environmental justice and research and development.
Thank you. I just would like to say a few words. I'm sure Rabbi Michael will have more things to add. First, I would like to point out that in the question already, there is this thin line of confusion of like, are we talking about the Jewish narrative or the Israeli narrative? And when we're talking about Islam, you know, is Islam Palestine and Palestine Islam, or is Judaism Israel and Israel Judaism? And it's not the case. It's more complicated than that. So yes, the Israeli Jewish narrative is louder in Israel than the Palestinian one, or than the Muslim one, or than the Christian one, or than the Bedouin one, or than the Armenian one. But within Judaism, also, if you look at the state, it's one kind of Judaism that is louder than many others. For example, it's the Orthodox Judaism that is much louder than the Reformed one. So each time we're talking about identity and narratives and stories, anywhere in the world, but it's very clear here in Israel-Palestine, we hit those issues of language and definition of what we're talking exactly about. And now to answer the question a little bit, I sound like such a politician. I'm just saying what I want based on whatever question I receive. It's terrible. But yes, of course, we are in an Israeli Jewish location because it's a kibbutz. And of course, the people who are living in the kibbutz would identify the vast majority as Jewish, and there's a synagogue. And so, of course, that's something that is addressed. And of course, I work with the students as dialogue facilitator. And of course, that's something that when national holidays come, or when religious holidays come, the community around us will follow the Jewish calendar and the national Israeli calendar. So when you're trying to create a community where everyone feels that they have a voice, you need to address that issue. You can't be blind to it. And it's a challenge because it's awkward, but you need to address it to make sure that there's room for the other holidays, for the other narratives, and that we explain what will happen. Because when a national holiday comes in, and it comes from the narrative that is against you, or that you grew up believing that was against you, how terrifying it is that this national holiday will happen all around you, and you don't know exactly what it means and what will happen. So it's a lot of acknowledging and answering questions and making space. And it's not always perfect, but it's part of trying to create a community where everyone can feel safe. And I really hope I kind of answered that question.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I would also encourage our audience also to come out and speak, because I think also we lack the Christian's point of view, which did try to have somebody to give us the Christian perspective. Also, we have Druze, we have Shia, we have also in Israel, we also have Ahmadiyya, and also one of the religion in Israel, actually, it's most holy and sacred sites in Haifa, it actually, all the religion is based about the love of nature. That religion is called Baha'iyyin. So if somebody would like to speak, would love to spot him. Meanwhile, I would love also to give a very interesting perspective about how actually we romanticize nature from both nationalistic side. For example, you could see on the ground how the prickly pear, which is a plant, is used in the Palestinians narrative and in the Jewish narrative. In the Palestinian narrative, it's a sign of sumud, steadfastness. Like, how come you recognize, let's say, uprooted Palestinian village or like deserted village? You see on the boundary the prickly pear plant, because usually the peasants and the farmers would plant them to draw the lines. In Israel, the prickly pear symbolized the new Jewish Israeli. Another interesting example, it's called the Arboreal Warriors. So the olive tree represents the Palestinians' identity, while the cypress actually represent the new Jewish European Israeli identity. And sometimes you could see it like the border between the Jewish and the Palestinians towns is like, you could see, where are the olive tree? It's Palestinian town. Where are the cypress tree? It's a Jewish Israeli town. And it's very interesting how we use the plants who are apolitical in also our stories and policies and politics and environment. And it's all like mishmash together. But those intricacies are very important for us also to understand that, you know, some things could mean whole different meaning to different narratives in there. Thank you so much.
So let me just add to all of this. So in terms of the Arav Institute, one of the successes, I would argue, we bring Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, and others together, and they're not just meeting over the conflict, but we do that in Pels and in other areas which is really crucial. But I have all the other touch points, which creates these relationships, as David Lair says, builds trust. Because if you trust somebody, you can vehemently disagree with somebody and go forward. And some of those touch points are people are cooking together, they're hiking together, taking classes together, sharing their music together, and sharing each other's religions. That's one of the bridges that we do there. It's not a builder of walls, but it's curious, like, oh, how does your religion celebrate? What are your religious foods? And so in that way, the Institute is able to use those differences of religion as a way to bring people together. The other fascinating thing is the Arab Institute sees itself as a regional center. Geopolitically, it happens to be in Israel, literally on the Israeli-Jordanian border, but it sees itself as part of the Middle East. So when we look at this, who's minority, who's majority, and how we perceive, we can talk within Israel, Jews are the majority, and we have all of these minorities underneath it. Within the larger Middle East, Jews are the minority, along with Christians and a whole lot of others. And so people hold, in some sense, both identities of majority and minority at the same time, which adds to the complexity of the conflict as well.
Could I add something? Have you finished, Michael?
Yeah, please, Yasmin.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm less involved with the Arava Institute. I've worked a little bit with them on a freelance basis, but the area that I work in is more around Jerusalem, where we have the whole entity of East Jerusalem, which is residents of Israel, but they have no citizenship. So they're kind of a community that fall between the lines of democracy, in a way. And they're also not openly in the West Bank under occupation. And I want to follow up a little bit on a couple of things that were mentioned before, in particular what Sarah was saying about the dominant, whose narrative is heard the loudest. And within the state of Israel, obviously, the Jewish narrative is the loudest, it being a Jewish and democratic state. But the question for me is it beneficial to just hear yourself all the time? Is it beneficial to always just advocate your own narrative because you have the loudest voice? And what it's actually having, the detrimental effect that I'm perceiving within East Jerusalem is that this Jewish narrative, which is where I come across is within the education system, because I work in the schools there with the National Parks Authority, is that the Arab-Israeli curriculum, which is run by the State of Israel, by the Ministry of Education of Israel, doesn't address an alternative to the Jewish narrative within the Arab sector. So, yes, we have situations where, as Arabs in Israel, we can learn about Jewish culture, Jewish festivals, everything else. In certain schools, even, there are Jews and Arab schools together. There are opportunities like at the Arab Art Institute where people can learn about each other. The areas that interest me more is the areas where they don't know any Jewish people. They're not citizens of the State of Israel. However, they're in Israeli schools that are not teaching them any alternative to the Jewish narrative and also not teaching them the Jewish narrative. So we have this kind of community that, unless they are still close to the Palestinian culture of the land, which is, as I explained, that peasant culture, if they have that from their family or the village that they live in or the town that they live in, they're not going to get it from the curriculum at school, because anything pre-1948 is not taught. And what you get is you get an apathy in the community that thinks that any problems that exist are blamed on everybody else. And this is really where the challenge lies for people like myself, who are trying to inspire passion for the situation of the environment, when they don't see any sense of responsibility. They don't feel any sense of responsibility to being part of the country. And this is really something that I think is turning into a detrimental situation to the people who shout the loudest, to the Jewish narrative as well. Because if you look at the situation in East Jerusalem, I can compare it to quite a lot of third world countries that I've been to, where, you know, rubbish isn't picked up and it's set fire to, and pollution is happening left, right, and center. So I think that, as Sarah was saying, the dominance of the Jewish, maybe yes, the Jewish Orthodox narrative in the country is at the end not enough on its own. So we really have to start looking at all of the minority narratives and culminating something that everyone can benefit from. And I think it starts with what Michael is saying, which is those meetings of actually meeting the other person that you've been separated from through the system. But we really have to get things to a policy level if we're going to change things around on a level of local pollution. Because until policy is changed, it's very, very, very difficult to start things from a grassroots level when you have no sense of responsibility within these communities.
Yeah, related to that, I would only add, and thank you for that, and this again is something we're able to do at the Arab Institute, is when we look at the land, which is what the conflict is over, from the perspective of geopolitics, we see these lines, borders, walls, and divisions where we don't want to know about the other. We just want to deal with ourselves. But when we look at this exact same piece of real estate from the perspective not of geopolitics, but of the environment, those walls, lines, and divisions are lessened. And we're not just invited, we're forced to work with the other. I often, twice a day, I like to ride my bike on the kibbutz, and I go to the Jordanian border in the winter. The clouds, when there are clouds in the winter there, they go from west to east. And when they get to the border at Israel and Jordan, the clouds don't go through passport control, right? They just float into Jordan, right? And the water aquifers underneath my feet don't know what side of the border they're on. And so when we look at this land at which the conflict is over from the sort of geopolitics, we get stuck. But when we transcend it by looking from the perspective of the environment, that opens up new vistas. And that's part of what you're talking about, Sarah, and the storytelling, what we do at Arva. And that's one of the ways that we're able to break out of this place that too many are stuck in.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you to both of you. And I just would like to add to what you both said, that storytelling and therefore narrative, they are political tools. They are political tools that are used by leaders in order to manipulate us or manipulate people and to create their own truth. And that's why, especially when there's conflict, only very few narratives are brought up, if not only one, and in a more simplistic way. Because when you're in a conflict, you don't want to get into too much layers and complexity. You just want your side to win. And so that's what is happening today, that there is only one narrative, and if you don't belong to it, you're a traitor. And that's something we've seen at play everywhere around the world. And we simplify a narrative as much as possible. We impose it. We hide the others because we want to win. And that's a way to win, because it is a political tool. And so we're also losing, as Jessica Yasmin said, we're losing so many stories of minorities, but even within the Jewish majority. But of course, we're losing the story of the Palestinian people. Their stories and history was not preserved. And it was easier to take over when you were the people of the book, when you were people whose entire survival was based on repeating of stories. We're good Jews at telling stories. And it's a wonderful thing, because that's what kept us alive. But in our context in Israel-Palestine, it became a terrible political tool, a very cruel one.
Thank you. Those are really great answers to that question. I have a couple more questions then. There's someone a participant who would like to share a perspective from Christianity on environmental narratives in that faith. But while she preps for that, I'm going to ask Sebastian's question. In the sustainable design permaculture framework, there is an idea that diversity alone, the richness of different species, is not enough to create a stable, healthy ecosystem. Rather, it is an interconnected diversity, a web of connections which creates stability and sustainability. How does this idea relate to the cultural diversity of the Middle East, more specifically, Israel-Palestine?
Can you just repeat the last bit of that question? How does
this relates to an interconnected diversity rather than just relates to the cultural Middle East?
Well, I could give a really good example of how actually Palestinians and Jews work together in their interfaith dialogue, because as Rabbi Michael said, they were forced to. For a good example, in the Jewish religion, the 7th year of agricultural activity called Shnat Shemitah, which means you need to give the land to rest. So, surprise, who is tilling and tending for the lands in the 7th year? It's actually the Palestinians. And I know some of my Palestinian friends, this is the most profitable year for them, because according to the Jewish kashrut laws, you are not allowed to work the land. So the Palestinians will take that opportunity and actually sell the Jews their agricultural product, because they interconnect with each other. Another good example is at Pesach, at Passover, the Hametz, the leavened, all the leavened products. Actually, the Jews give it to their Muslim neighbors, and after the Passover is over, they will get it back and they will do some kind of, celebratory meeting. For example, Moroccan Jews have this Maimuna, where at the end
North African, it's also in Tunisia and Algeria.
My Moroccan Jewish friend told me it's a Moroccan tradition.
I know, we have some tension with Moroccan Jews.
Okay, I'm sorry. So North African, I apologize. So North African Jews, I know this really nice story where we will invite their Muslim neighbors after they have restored their leavened hametz, and they will give them back very tasty cookies, and Sarah could elaborate more about those tasty cookies and those traditions. So those are really nice examples of how we could cooperate. Beside the politics, because those some occasions are very political. From Palestinian perspective, for example, there is Land Day, Yawm al-Ard. Yawm al-Ard, especially in the 48 Palestinian community, which is called the Arab-Israeli community, is pivotal. It's not celebrated, but it's remembered every year, where we walk to the uprooted Palestinian villages in Israel, where we try to connect with our land, because part of our psyche. But I think it should not be only political and contentious. There are so many examples. For one of those I could give, we work now together on a book with Palestinian, Israeli, Jordanian narratives on a medicinal herb and their role in the folklore of each people, of each tradition. And it's really amazing how to see how every culture relate to this plant from a different point of view. Sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're really different. So I think here where you can go is to find those helpful, those meaningful connections. And also, I think, as also Jessica Yasmin said, not also shy away from discussing their political, sometimes contentious aspects, because at the end of the day, they're gonna just go out to the surface when you have a political crisis like the one that we have right now in Jerusalem.
Yeah. My answer to the question about the permaculture, back in the day when I was still at university, I did, it was back when they still had the local agenda 21, which was, environmental goals for each local authority. I think it was the European-wide initiative. And in Bradford, which is the neighbouring city to where I studied, the local council decided to use permacultural principles in order to forward the local Agenda 21 initiatives that they were doing. So they were looking at the principles of permaculture and then translating them into not just, growing food and the environment, but also how to manage the council itself, but then within the council, all of the public realm planting. So I remember there being a policy that wherever there was, roadside planting or everything else, that it would be plants that you could, get some kind of crop out of afterwards. Now, coming to live in Israel and living in a small Arab village where my mother-in-law in particular is like me, we both love gardening. We spend a lot of time gardening together. And very quickly, she disapproved of my herbaceous borders, which I like to grow, coming from England, and told me that if you're going to water something, then it needs to give you something back. And that's basically the same principle as permaculture, that you put in minimum effort for maximum output. So I think that there is a strong connection between permaculture and not just the indigenous attitude towards the environment that I live with here. I think, again, as Sarah said, we're talking here about the local situation between Israelis and Palestinians, but we can look at different examples of this all over the world of minority indigenous communities and the threats that they're coming under from majority communities that have, come and taken over their land or whatever. So for me, I think permaculture is something that shouldn't just be confined to growing your potatoes and tires and things like this, but it really should be something that starts to be taught in schools as principles of how to design all sorts of social structures, from organizations to businesses to everything else. And I think there are strong links between the inspiration of permaculture and a lot of indigenous relationships to the land. And we can definitely draw parallels to the Palestinian culture. And like I said before, for me, the question is, how do we bring legitimacy to the Palestinian narrative from the Jewish perspective? Because at the end of the day, the organizations that I'm working with to forward environmental principles in this country are organizations that come from a Zionist background. The JNF was responsible for taking a lot of the land that is now part of Israel from the Palestinians. The National Parks Authority that I work with are still designating national parks on the border between East Jerusalem and the Palestinian territories, to the detriment of the expansion of the Arab population of Jerusalem. So if you're coming from those kinds of institutions to the Palestinian population or the Arab Israeli population, and you're trying to instill in them principles of looking after the environment, you really have to start to understand how their narrative can add to what you're saying. And until the policymakers or the people who are in charge of these organizations start to understand the pluses of listening to the other narrative, with the difficulties that Farid is talking about, with opening up a bit of the politics, talking about before 1948 and where people were and what they did, I think it's only then that we can start to forward a narrative that gives legitimacy not just to itself as the main narrative of the country, but also to be able to add and take from other legitimate narratives that exist. Just another afterthought, when you were mentioning earlier about the Christian, we don't have so much Christian input in this particular seminar now, and obviously I also would welcome if anyone wants to comment. My personal experience of the tiny Christian community that I know in Jerusalem, my daughters both go to a Christian school, they go to a convent school, and I must say, compared to my experience of the Arab Muslim population, the Christians are a tiny minority, but they really invest in educating the next generation. In general, I'm going to generalize, of course, in general, the best academic institutions are Christian. The friends that I have who are Palestinian Christians are, in general, better educated, more cultured, more aware of the arts than their Muslim peers. And I think that that should be commended. I think that the Christian population of Jerusalem in particular have managed to cling on and maintain their Palestinian identity without getting too involved in the politics and the violence and all the ideologies and things like this. So that's the reason that me and my husband are very happy to have both our daughters in the convent school in East Jerusalem, because it really is giving them access to their Palestinian culture, which both on the Israeli side and in the Muslim Palestinian side, I haven't been able to get. So I would say that if there's anything I can say about the Christian community here, is that they are kind of just getting on with things, which is probably what we all need to learn from as well.
Great, thank you so much. There's someone who does want to share, Adina. I don't know that we have time, so maybe Adina, you can share the thing about your culture's environmental narrative after 2:30 for whoever wants to stay on. Rabbi Michael, I would like everybody, maybe if you have any closing words. If not, there was one question from Charlie. Can you recommend books, especially for those not from the region, that show both sides of the conflict, or in relation to stories or storytelling and of environmental narratives? Or I guess I would pull that up to any sort of books or movies, texts that might provide some more insight into what we talked about today. So if you have closing words or closing statements to make, that would be great. If not, you can answer this question or both.
So not necessarily so much about the environment, but there's a wonderful book called Side by Side by Sami Adwan and Baron, where basically you go through 100 years of the history of the conflict, and one page is the Palestinian narrative and the other is the Israeli narrative. So that'll give you more of a political. Sarah may know some things more in terms of different storytelling. Yossi Klein Olivny just wrote a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors, where he tries to explain Zionism to a Palestinian audience. In my class in the dual narrative at Bennington College, we read Sari Nasueba's memoir, Growing Up, as a counter to that. It's kind of a dialogue of these two narratives. So there are lots of ways. If you write to us, we can probably send you other books. I just want to close with this topic here, that in all of these religions, we have this notion God creates the world and it's been put on loan to us. And this is my glass, I take care of it. But if I were to give it to Sarah, I know she would take better care of it because it's not hers, because I've loaned it to her. And that's underlying all of these religious orientations to the environment, is this world is on loan to us, which means that we need to take care of it very specially because it's on loan and it does not belong to us. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Who's next?
You.
Okay. With regards to books or things, I must say that one thing, I watched a 4-part drama called The Promise. You can look it up on YouTube. It's not anything to do with the environment, but it's a brilliant summing up of the complicatedness of all narratives in the country. It's fiction, but it really, having lived here for as long as I have, and also crossing over from both the Arab to the Jewish to the Palestinian territories. Often I speak both languages. I really felt that it was the beginnings of a kind of good setup for understanding where all the complicatedness comes from in this country. So if people are more interested in the kind of trying to make a bit more sense of where all the animosity comes from, that's, I think, a 4-part drama that is worth looking up, but it is fiction. I'm not saying that it's any kind of science-based or evidence-based drama. With regards to kind of summing up today, I kind of feel like we're just asking questions, or just starting to ask the right questions. With all of the kishkushim, what you call them, I haven't even written out a proper speech. I mean, for me, it's all kind of like brainstorming pages to try and work out exactly where our challenges are in this whole idea of the role of religion, desert ecology, and cultural narrative in promoting environmental diplomacy in order to tackle the global crisis. We get to the crossover of the three, religion, environment, and culture, which is really where we should try and find the optimum relationship. We're not there yet, but that's where the optimum relationship lies, I guess, in that you take the right bits of the religion, the right bits of the environment, and the right bits of culture, and somehow you can start to forward a much more cohesive way of living where we're not destroying or shooting ourselves in our foot, really. I mean, I think in recent events, and particularly with the COVID pandemic, it's becoming more and more obvious that the balance is out of balance. So this optimum relationship at the moment seems to be in crisis. And that takes me back to that area that Farid was talking about when I first joined you all, from Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second surah in the Quran, where God creates Adam, and he says to the angel, he presents Adam to the angels and says, I'm going to place my Khalifa or my deputy or my viceroy on earth. And the angel's response is, will you place therein someone who will make mischief and shed blood while we praise you and glorify you? And God's reply, surely I know what you do not know. I just want to go back on those two sentences. So the angels are highlighting the situation that we're in. I often get terribly depressed about the situation of the world, especially the environment, and the frustration of not being able to do enough, and not making our voices heard, whatever part of society we're from. And when I watch the news, I do just see destruction and mischief and bloodshed, all the wars, all the violence, all the intolerance, the extremism, the people are so quick to judge each other. And I can understand the angel's concern. But then in God's reply, where he says that he knows what we do not know, this is where I think the hope of the optimum situation lies, because as well as all this negative stuff that we're bombarded with, especially through the media, we have to remember that human beings have an amazing capacity to do good. And that's really where I think the hope for the future lies, is to start promoting the good rather than reporting the bad. So that's how I would close today's session.
Thank you. So we're at 12:30 right now, so I want to give Sarah a few moments to say what she wants to say. If people want to stay on for a few more minutes, I'll be on as well. And then I will give it over to Farid to give his summary.
Thank you, Frances. I also would like to thank all the brave souls who kept their camera open. Mazal, Dave, Dana, Adina, Mark, Gregory earlier, and Julio. Like, it really means a lot. It's very nice, so thank you. And thank you everyone who stayed until the end. So yes, instead of for books, there's what Rabbi Michael talked about, side by side, which I can be critical of, but is there and has a merit to exist. You also have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a beginner's guide, that is also written both by an Israeli Jewish historian and a Palestinian one, like side by side, but instead of doing page and page, it's one, like one narrative after the other. And just that is an interesting thing to think about. Can we really do a one page after the other? Or do we need to go by themes? Or do we need to go by year? Or do we need to just tell an entire narrative and then the others because they don't begin at the same time? You can also, it's not exactly about the environment, but it's about the narratives. And if you go on YouTube and you also Google Duron narrative, Israel-Palestine, Yalla Young Leaders, you have a very short animation that was made by 2 of my participants just because they discovered that they didn't have the same stories. And you also have Disturbing the Peace, that is a wonderful movie made by activists from Combatant for Peace that also explains how the news tells stories that push us against each other. And finally, what I want to say is that a story is never neutral. There's always someone writing the story, someone telling the story with an intention. So why are we telling the stories? And why are we remembering those stories? So always being critical, because if justice is justice for all, and if justice is our goal, then we can only make room for all the stories and not only cherry pick those we want. Because even within the Jewish narrative, somehow Bereshit, what is Bereshit in English?
Genesis.
Thank you, Farid. I love that you're the one helping me. So the Genesis is the most environmental text ever. It's about being responsible for nature, for the next generations. And somehow we tend to forget it, even in our Israeli Jewish narrative. We should be the most environmental country in the world. And we're not. So a story always has a political, like in political context, there's always a political mean to a story, and anywhere a story is never neutral, told by someone, written by someone with an intention. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Reen, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I would love to say that time flew. I did not want to give you the spoiler that I think I'm biased here, but this is the best session so far. Like, I did not feel like the preparatory meeting. Like, for me, I would love to say it was very meaningful, deep, and spiritual. I would love to say that this was Becky's session, but Becky also, today we're flooded with good news. Becky has a bat mitzvah, so she could not make it to the concluding part. So I will try to do my best to fill out in her shoes. Becky, Alf Mabruk and Mazal Tov for the bat mitzvah. I would love to conclude with the poem by Mahmoud Darwish, and which says, على هذه الأرض ما يستحق الحياة. When on this land, there is what deserves to live for. And like translate literally like this, on this land that we're living, we should live because there are things that deserve us to live on this land. And every time when I feel pessimistic, I just like read this sentence from that poem and I think, wow, put things into perspective. Which legacy are giving to the next generation? And because we deserve everybody to live on this land in peace, with dignity, we're trying to do our best to give them this opportunity to live on this land. So having said so, I think relating to the question how we could build this web, trying to connect, to build those bridges between the different stories and narrative will create, I think, an encyclopedia, amazing one, where we could not only tell our story, but read different stories, and our brain will compare it without effort. Like we will try to be enriched by different narratives, and then we can be also autocritical, look inward, the same time outward. And I would love to say that also, if we're looking forward, where we would like to go, I think religion, although I need to admit I'm not a religious person, but religions play a critical role in environmentalism. If religions shy away from the environmental aspect, we will not achieve the climate change goal of the United Nations. Bear in mind, there are at least 5 billion people who listen to their religious leader. Those leaders will speak most efficiently, I think. Again, I'm not a religious person, but this is reality. And sometimes I feel that this this domain of religious environmentalism is always overlooked by, let's say, scientific and transboundary cooperation between different countries. And that's why we wanted to give this subject its due respect, because it's very important. Imagine if the Pope Francis now will give emphasis on environmentalism, or the Imam at Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Rabbi. I would just give very nice example. One of the alumni of the Institute made an initiative called Mikhtab Rabbanim, which is called, like translated, the Rabbi's letter, in which religious rabbi in Israel issued tzav, a religious a law, which outlaw the using of single-use plastic. So I'm just because from a Jewish religious point of view, it's not kosher because it harms the environment. So imagine what could every one of us add to this discussion effort if our religious leaders will step and take the lead. So with this, I would love to thank you, but the discussion is not over yet. If somebody, I know it's late, but I really would love to hear more perspective, more insight. So if somebody would love to share, me and Francis are here to stay. And I think our guests, hopefully if they don't have anything afterward, but we would love to have the discussion continuing. And also I would recommend two books. The one is called the Al-Mutasha'il. It's translated the Optimist. It's like the hybridization of optimist and pessimist. It's a Palestinian novel which describes most of the Palestinian state of mind. You're optimist and pessimist at the same time, how you could live with it. So it's called Al-Mutasha'il, in English, Optimist. The second book, and also I'm not trying to do a PR work, but it's really a wonderful, nice book about medicinal desert herb, which is written by three groups: Israeli Jews, Palestinians, and Jordanians, mapping desert plants and explaining about their life cycle through the folklore lens of every culture. So I would love to share it on the Google Drive. I worked in a project called Water Matters, and one of the projects was to do this kind of collaboration. So it's very interesting if you want to hear about plants from different perspective and aspects from the people who live in this area. Thank you so much. And if somebody would like to join us and now give us questions or insights, we gladly would love to hear him. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that there were a couple people, and again, this is beyond our time, so if anybody has to leave, including our speakers, it's very okay. But I know Adina Friedman wanted to share something.
Sorry, please fill the form, the feedback form. It's very important. Lately, you're not doing your job and not filling the feedback form. Please, everybody fill it. We take your comments very seriously.
Should I share?
Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Adina Friedman. I'm Israeli, but I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. area. So earlier here. So following on some of the examples that just by chance, I was going to say this before Farid mentioned Morocco, but it's related. So in Morocco, so when we talk about shared borders or shared environment beyond borders, most of the organizations right now that are present here work on the immediate borders because that's who we can work with, like Jordanians, Israelis, Palestinians. And it used to be Egyptians too sometime in the past. But I want to tell about a project in Morocco, for example, where they're also leading environmental and renewable energy and sustainable development kinds of work going on that also, so sustainable development kind of by definition is at the core of sustainable peace building, as I see it. And it also, the work itself encompasses a lot of the same kinds of things. It's participatory, it's bottom up with some top down aspects. It should include empowering marginalized communities, marginalized groups like women or youth, and interfaith work and preserving culture, all these wonderful things that are basically at the core of peace building to begin with. So one of the projects in particular in Morocco, for example, that I work with, has to do with So Jews are physically not present anymore in a lot of places in the, let's say, high Atlas Mountains in different villages. But one of the organizations that's based in Marrakesh, but works all over the place, works on sustainable development, primarily in Amazigh villages. But it plants fruit trees. I won't tell you the whole thing now, it's too long, but I can send you information. It plants fruit trees, but it needs land to grow the saplings for the first 3 years. And it does so, a lot of the land that it gets is from the Jewish community, basically where Jews no longer live physically, but own the land, own mostly cemeteries and tombs of saints or tzaddikim. And so it's another kind of collaboration between the Jewish community, even in its physical absence, and the Muslim community, without calling it that, but in effect doing that. And one of the things that I won't go into in detail now, but I'll send those of you whose email I have, I'll send you later, is a project so I've been bringing Israelis, fewer Palestinians, mostly because of cost issues, but Israelis and Palestinians to work with Moroccans, not because now it's a hot thing because there's a new deal, but because that thing that some of you talked about earlier with the power relations and what it's like to be, say, with Israelis and Palestinians in a primarily Jewish country. So to take parties to a different context where actually it's a Muslim majority context, it's actually neither really Arab nor Jewish because it's Amazigh primarily, but it's a different context, and there are multiple identities and identity groups within Morocco, so it's complicating the stories there. It's not as simple as Jews and Muslims lived forever, happily, but rather looking at, it's a mutual learning process about identities, about a different story of Jews, in this case in Morocco, hopefully one day in Algeria too, as soon as it's possible. But the point is to take groups from Israel, Palestine, and maybe Jordan, and immerse them in another context with different power relations, a different environment, but learning together about issues that all communities are concerned with and can learn from one another. So I'll be happy at another opportunity to tell you more or to email you more. But yeah, there's lots of stuff to read about it as well. Thanks.
Thank you so
That's
much,
great.
Adina. I just love to ask, how come, how come you're involved in this project? I think you're from Ashkenazi Jewish background, and you live in Washington, at the end of the world left, how they say here. So how did you create this connection?
Okay, so the backstory in short is that I always wanted to visit Morocco for a long time. My field is both environmental stuff and biology, but peace building, conflict resolution, etc. And Lebanon and Morocco were on my list. I ended up going first to Morocco in 2005. I ended up meeting a Muslim Amazigh guy and marrying him in Morocco and in Israel. A whole other few books I could write about that. And so there was a combination of my professional interests and my connections. We're not married for a long time anymore, but we share a daughter. And so she visits, I take her to visit her family. But basically I'm going for professional things, but this personal aspect has added. So my daughter being half and half Jewish, half Muslim, half Amazigh, half Ashkenazi, American, Israeli, all this mishmash. So we usually actually combine, where I can, visits to the family, like when I do home hospitality with groups, which I anyway would have done with anyone, but since I happen to have family there, I include them as well in it. And it's all immersive. So all the work there is immersive and interactive, and it stems. So way before I went there, I was a participant in groups like that of Israelis, and in this case, it was Jews and Bedouin going to Egypt in the early days of the peace deal. So that experience that was to me life-changing, of going Jews and Arabs together to another context, to reflect on ourselves, not just learn about another context, but to learn about ourselves through that other context. So it's basically to do with stories and the dialogue and all these other things, just on wheels. Like while you're in another place, you're doing it. And yeah, so that's, anyway, and Morocco is a fascinating place. There's a lot, so much to
Thank
see.
you for sharing your private story, but also if you revealed your secret, I also would love to reveal my secret. I also stem from a multicultural background. My father is a Palestinian Muslim background. My mother is a Ukrainian Christian background. So I think those you all the time hear the dual narrative, like so it stems in you, and especially you live in a place like the Holy Land, like here, you hear not only dual and like you
Yeah.
hear multiple narrative all the time. Just like everybody has different interpretation of everything. And just Sarah said, it's everybody's story, even religion, sometimes even also in national story. Every village, every town will tell you different story. And I think we should respect those stories and we should share them. And one of the problems, I think, in the Palestinian also narrative, the fact is not documented. And unlike, let's say, the Jewish Israel narrative, where it's a very, Israeli Jews are very good at documenting on all levels, which I applaud them for that, try to learn from them. And we, the problem, don't have a written documentation. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now, it's called oral history. We're actually going door to the last pillars, like the elders, and try to let them speak and hear their last stories. And I think this is something that could be on a global level, because in all the indigenous community, we're losing this very important heritage. People are dying and taking away with them this, not biodiversity, but biohuman folklore diversity with them. And sometimes it's gonna be lost forever. It's such a shame. I would love to hear if somebody has, Sarah, Rabbi Michael, Jasmine, or anybody have a comment or would like to join the discussion.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And we know that poll after poll shows that younger Israelis and Palestinians don't have buy-in to, let's call it the peace process for a use of a term. They have nothing to latch onto. It's the post-Intifada 1, post-Intifada 2, Gulf War this, Gulf War that, post-9/11. They have nothing to latch onto. The older generation, as difficult as the relation with Israelis and Palestinians have been, Israelis and Palestinians who remember pre-48, they remember, despite the troubles, there were stories of cooperation. And even before 67, or even early, if I can use this word, I'll be very careful, the benign occupation at first, it started that way. It's not that way now, but there was a very different feel immediately right after 67, 68, 69, when people were getting to know each other before it became this rigid, horrible thing. Those stories we need to be reminded of, because the young generation really believes we're all fools to believe that Jews and Arabs can get along. And that's why those stories are so important, even with the complexities, and I don't want to minimize them, of those relationships.
Sarah, would you like to add something, please?
Yeah, no, I really like what you just said, Rabbi Michael. It's about what is the narratives we've fed for the past few generations. And I also work with teenagers, and they are a lot more hopeless than I was when I was their age. Because they were born after Oslo. And so they were born in a divided world where it was either them or us. And so we need to bring diversity and complexity in the stories we tell, because we're also missing out of the identity of so many people, like Adina said. Today, the majority of the country is actually Mizrahi in Israel, but we lost our stories. They were not kept because they were called Mizrahi, when Mizrach to what? We are Arab Jews, and yes, calling us Arab Jews was taking the risk to keep us close to our Palestinian brothers and sisters. But the truth is that it also erased our identity, calling us Mizrahi and putting us all in one bag. When people from Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, we all have different stories. And within our population, it's really like our wake-up call we need to have to ask elders for their stories. I'm working with teenagers, and when we do work storytelling, suddenly I have teens telling me that one of their Palestinian kids, that one of their grandparents is a Jew. And that's not a story they can tell anywhere else. Or I have Russian kids who are, yes, officially Jewish, but actually don't really identify like it, but they are afraid to talk about it at school. I have kids who are also mixed of Polish and Iranian, and they have so many stories to tell. So it's really the time, it's now or never, to ask for those stories, because they're going to be lost. And we're going to lose ourselves if we lose our complexity.
If I can add something to this, I would say that our experience of opening our house to people, which we did first and foremost for Jewish youth groups who wanted a perspective on Arab-Israeli life here, and it's grown to lots and lots of different people coming. But in the last year with the COVID, we've actually had more and more Israelis coming to eat a meal and sit with us, and there's a good lot of storytelling that happens around the table after a good meal. And I would say I would agree with all the points that you've just made. In particular, there's a generation who remembers the beginnings of the state, where really Arabs and Jews felt, specifically in our part of the country, around Abu Ghosh and the kibbutzes that are around us, that they were building the state together. Things then started to change after 1967, but there was still this time when Jews freely went into the West Bank, and there was a mix of or a getting to know each other's cultures, which nowadays is unheard of. And I think that we really have to be wary of the direction of the politics in this in today's Israel, because they really, I'm going to go back on a point that I made before, they really don't see that there could possibly be a benefit in understanding the other. And I absolutely think it's to their detriment that they are following such narrow narratives, even from each other as fellow Jews. So I would definitely say that these stories are important and need to be told. And what we found is that there aren't enough spaces for that to happen. That's what we're trying to do with our open house, is simply to provide a space where people can meet and they can talk and they can share and they can start to understand. And we need a lot more of those spaces or stages or whatever you want to call them, in order for reparations to be made of, past traumas, but also to promote a new understanding of how this country should develop into the future, as a shared country of Jews and non-Jews. So that would be my comment. And I'm also going to take the opportunity to leave the meeting, if you don't mind, because I have some sheep I need to go and milk now. So I'm very, very privileged to have taken part, and thank you very much. And I really enjoyed meeting you all on Zoom. And I will say good night and Ramadan Kareem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramadan Kareem. And I always love hearing what you have to say, Jessica, Yasmin. So good.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, shukran, Yasmin.
Thank you. Afwan. Shukran.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I would love to thank also dear Frances, because she's the woman behind all of the project. She stays late and she do all the logistics and all the facilitating. So big applause for dear Frances. And I'd love to thank all of you. Wow, it's half an hour past the original time and we did not feel it. So looking forward for our next session. And please be engaged. I think Rabbi Michael's and Sarah and Jessica's email and infos are on the Padlet, on the shared Google Drive. Please go there, connect with them, try to create the creative community that we've spoken about. If somebody of you is interested in the religious dialogue, you could discuss it or address it in the next session, so that also can maybe create an interactive community of storytelling, the different narratives. Like we can, I don't know, maybe do this in encyclopedia where we just collect all of the stories and put them in one big human heritage encyclopedia. What do you think, Sarah? Maybe at the end, this is a project that our community could work on.
I think it's totally feasible. Like an archive of the stories of the people here.
Yeah, the human archive. Well, I'm sorry, I'm so enjoying this session so much. I don't want you to go, but you're more than welcome to go, because I need to go to sleep and also to work tomorrow. But if not going, I'm not going to end this session. So
okay, Fareed, to make it.
Yeah.
Wait, Fareed, to make your life easier, I'm going to go off now so you can go to sleep.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Michael.
Thank you, Sarah, Franny, and everyone else, Rebecca, Lori, who put this together. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good day, good night. Ramadan Kareem.
Ramadan
Ramadan
Kareem.
Kareem, everybody.
Lag
Bye-bye.
BaOmer, it's Pesach Sheni tonight. So if you have leftover matzah, make matzah brei tonight or tomorrow.
Wow.
We make it with grated cheese and
There's a
maple syrup
second
here in
Pesach?
Vermont. It's called the Second Pesach. It's a very minor
You know-
holiday. If you miss Pesach the first time, you get to do it a second time.
Wow.
Freedom again. Freedom again. On that note.
Well, that note, don't forget your matzahs, Rabbi Michael.
Bye.
Okay, thank you so much.